Hello again. These days, the use of torture against political prisoners is very much frowned upon throughout the whole world. We in Britain are particularly touchy about this, and if anybody seeks asylum here and deporting them would mean that they might be subject to torture, it's automatic grounds for not being able to deport that person. I would talk today a little about a time when Britain wasn't quite so touchy about torture. In fact, 50 years ago, the British government of the day was actually authorising the use of torture against political prisoners within the United Kingdom. But we've forgotten all about it now. I just thought it would be interesting to talk a little about this so that the next time that some official in our government gets on their high horse and starts talking about how we must all avoid torture and maintain the highest levels of humanitarian beliefs and so on, just so we don't forget that in the 1970s, the British government of the day actually organised and arranged for the torture of political prisoners held in this country indefinitely without trial. The operation of internment without trial was called by the army Operation Demetrius. I'm sure some people will remember that in Northern Ireland, habeas corpus was suspended and political prisoners were simply arrested and held indefinitely in, I would call them concentration camps, others refer to them as internment camps, it's the same thing. They were held for years without trial. Arresting those suspects, though, was only the first stage in the process. Most of those who had not been released would end up in the camp at Long Kesh, or on the prison ship, or in another base near Londonderry. For 14 of those men that were arrested, though, during Operation Demetrius, the arrest of thousands of people who were suspected of being involved with the IRA, being held without charge was the beginning of an absolute nightmare. The army were under orders from London to track down the leaders of the insurgency in Northern Ireland at that time, which is the summer of 1971. And the way that they were to accomplish this task was by the use of torture. For many years it was assumed that the torturing of the IRA suspects seized in 1971 had been a piece of private enterprise on the part of junior officers, men who had become a little over-enthusiastic about the interrogation of suspects. It was not until many years later that it came to light that these men were, far from acting on their own initiative, obeying orders from the very top of the command chain. Even before the news leaked out of the systematic torture of selected prisoners, those released 48 hours after being arrested had disturbing tales to tell. Some had allegedly been forced to run the gauntlet between rows of soldiers who were swinging batons at them. Others had been taken into helicopters while blindfolded, and then after the helicopters had taken off and been flying for a while, were told that they were hundreds of feet in the air. They were then thrown out of the open door of the helicopter. Only when they landed with a bump a second later did they discover that the helicopters had only been hovering a few feet above the ground. The stories related by the men who had been arrested and then freed were so similar that it was unlikely that they were simply inventions. The British Army were experimenting with fairly crude techniques to break the spirits of their prisoners. Although the methods used on many of the men who had been picked up with a view to interning them were little more than playful cruelty, more sophisticated ways of interrogation were ready to be used. These were known as the 5 techniques, and they represented the culmination of the Army's experience around the world throughout the 20th century in extracting information from those who were reluctant to part with it. There had been honed to perfection in Cyprus, Aden, Malaysia, Kenya, and so on. 14 men were subjected to these methods of obtaining information. The prisoners who were felt to be in possession of valuable information were flown to the former RAF base of Ballykelly, which since 2nd of June 1971 functioned as an army barracks. A special interrogation centre had been set up at Ballykelly, and the idea was that by quickly getting as much information from the men taken there, the army might be able to put an end to the activities of the provisional IRA once and for all. In defence of the army, it must be remembered that at this stage of the Troubles it was still thought that with a little firm action the civil unrest could be nipped in the bud. It was this frame of mind which led to the next stage of Operation Demetrius. We must remind ourselves that the men who had been arrested by the army and taken to Ballykelly had not been detained for any specific offence, nor were they to be charged or brought before a court. These men had been picked up with a view to holding them indefinitely in a concentration camp, but first they were to be tortured. This is not incidentally a snap judgment on my part, but rather the verdict of the European Commission on Human Rights in 1976. What were the 5 techniques used over the course of a week on those being questioned? Firstly, they were subject to the withholding of food and drink, deprivation of sleep, prolonged exposure to noise, hooding, and being made to stand against a wall for long periods of time. Together, these methods produced disorientation and confusion in all who were subjected to them. The men were kept handcuffed and their heads covered with hoods while being kept in cold cells where they were subjected to so-called white noise, loud hissing, which drowned out all the other sound. This sensory deprivation made it impossible for them to keep track of time, and they didn't know if it was day or night. They were forced, while still hooded, to stand against walls in stressful and uncomfortable positions, with their arms stretched above their heads and leaning forward against the wall. Those who collapsed were beaten and forced to resume the position. While this was going on, it was of course impossible to sleep, and they were offered nothing to eat or drink. The result of this treatment was that the men began to suffer from hallucinations and to lose consciousness. While this was going on, their heads were sometimes banged against the wall, and they were threatened with even more severe mistreatment if they didn't cooperate with their interrogators. Word leaked out about what was being done to those interned, and the British government appointed Sir Edmund Compton, a distinguished civil servant, to investigate the claims being made in newspapers about what had been going on in Ballykelly. Although the language he used was balanced and appeared to bend over backward to avoid suggesting that the security forces in Northern Ireland had been guilty of torture, the report of the Compton Committee, which was published on 16th of November 1971, infuriated Prime Minister Edward Heath. Before seeing what Edward Heath had to say, we might look at a passage from the report which explained away the brutality used during the interrogations, and indeed explained why there had in fact not been any brutal behaviour at all. Sir Edmund's explanation is a masterpiece. Where we have concluded that physical ill-treatment took place, we are not making a finding of brutality on the part of those who handled these complainants. We consider that brutality is an inhuman or savage form of cruelty, and that cruelty implies a disposition to inflict suffering coupled with indifference to or pleasure in the victim's pain. We don't think that happened here. In other words, the Compton Committee decided that because the soldiers hadn't enjoyed what they were doing, it was impossible for their actions to be brutal. This stunning piece of sophistry, which effectively exculpated any of the staff at the Ballykelly Interrogation Centre from the charge of brutality or cruelty, struck some people at the time as bizarre. Despite doing their best to describe the treatment of those who became known as the hooded men as physical ill treatment and not torture, Edward Heath was disgusted by what he saw as support for the IRA against the army. He wrote in a memo, "It seems to me one of the most unbalanced, ill-judged reports I have ever read." The memo, which came to light shortly before Heath's death in 2005, continued, "When you go through the report carefully, the number of incidents involved in the arrest of 300 men was small," which meant that since only 14 out of 300 were tortured, this could perhaps be disregarded. Heath was absolutely livid about the report. He felt it was an attack on the army. Here they seem to have gone to endless lengths to show that anyone not given 3-star hotel facilities suffered hardship and ill treatment. It was to be 40 years before the truth about the torture of the men arrested and interned was to come to light. In the course of a television programme about the interrogation techniques used, the RTE television station in the Republic of Ireland came across some correspondence between former Home Secretary Merlin Rees and then Prime Minister James Callaghan. In a documentary broadcast in 2014, a letter sent by Rees in 1977 was revealed, which contained the following passage. It is my view, confirmed by Brian Faulkner before his death, that this decision to use methods of torture in Northern Ireland in 1971 was taken by ministers, in particular Lord Carrington, then the Secretary of State for Defence. In other words, not only was it admitted that torture had been used, but it was sanctioned by the government in London and was not some action undertaken by maverick army officers on their own initiative. I've got into this in a little detail because it is worth bearing all this in mind, how values, how opinions change over just a few brief years. We're not talking about something that happened here during the Victorian era. We're talking about well within living memory. I was in Northern Ireland 50 years ago. This is within my memory. This is not something that, we've got to look at history books to find out about. The British government 50 years ago was organising and authorising the torture of political prisoners before locking them up in concentration camps. And this happened in the United Kingdom, not in some faraway colonial war. So the next time we see the government of this country being very delicate and denouncing torture, let's remember that it's not so long ago that we were up to those tricks themselves.